Okay, thanks. Well, I've got an awful lot to get through tonight, so I'm not going to. There's no jokes to start off with. I'm just going to get straight into this. So, okay, a lot of what I want to talk about tonight is sort of a little bit centered on Europe, but sort of Europe in relationship to the world. And I'm going to start by just saying a little bit about two major events, in exogenous events, that's to say outside of the internal development of society in Europe, that impact the development of European society, impact the development of global society, in fact, but impact the development of European society in the 1300s. The first is the onset of the so-called Little Ice Age, a period of relative global cooling that begins about 1300 and ends around 1700, early 1750, something like that. So we're talking about relatively lower temperatures in the north in Europe. We're talking about winters, hard winters. This is a little bit later from the 1500s, but Bruegel's painting. You can see frozen ponds, people skating, stuff like that. I mean, stuff we might be a little more used to here, but is not normal in most of Europe. So colder temperatures and increased rainfall, and a series of poor harvests, and increasing economic difficulties, agricultural difficulties, particularly at the margins of cultivation. So the abandonment of the Viking settlements in Greenland takes place around this time. We have increased hunger, the beginnings of brigandage, of plundering, gangs of robbers, stuff like that, starting to emerge. The second thing, which is sort of very, very close in time to this, is the impact of the global pandemic of bubonic plague that takes place beginning in the late 1340s and really sort of reaching its maximum about 1351. So very, very rapid spread of bubonic plague. In a certain sense, of course, the rapidity of the spread of the plague is a sign of the increasing global connectivity. We talked in the last lecture a little bit about the Pax Mongolica, about the Mongol peace, the route, the Silk Road, overland Silk Road routes, and you can see this at least sort of theorized model beginning around the Black Sea and actually spreading both ways, east and west, along the routes of the Silk Road into China and into Western Europe. Estimated in many parts of Europe, the mortality in the region of 50%. Some parts of England even higher, 60-70%. I mean, this is a devastating plague. Global population decreases from estimated 450 million to about 350 million over this very short period. And as you can see, whole villages in Germany and elsewhere deserted as a result of this. Just sort of by comparison, the impact in China, this also coincides with the breakdown of the Yuan dynasty in China that we talked a little, the Mongol invasion dynasty of China that breaks down right around this time, 1368, the Ming dynasty begins. So there's a political turmoil, political crisis in China right around this same time. So I want to just sort of talk for a minute about some of the impacts of these two phenomenon. the global cooling on the one hand, the Little Ice Age on the one hand, and the impact of bubonic plague in Europe on the other. And to sort of do that, I have to sort of take a little step back and just talk a little bit about what had happened during the so-called High Middle Ages, the height of feudal development in Europe from about 1000 through to around 1250, 1300. The dates are kind of interesting. They're actually when the Little Ice Age and the plague hit Western Europe, the economic peak of feudal development has already passed. In other words, these are impacting on a society in which difficulties, economic and social difficulties, are already becoming evident. So how does that happen? In the High Middle Ages, we see another significant advance, significant leap forward in agricultural productivity, and I've just sort of highlighted some of the features of that here. The better plow technology, the development of horse harnesses so that horses could actually pull a heavy plow. It takes a remarkably long time for horses to be harnessed in a way that doesn't choke them. So we see this developing in Europe in the High Middle Ages. The utilization of wind and water power. So again, we are using non-muscle power forms of power generation primarily to grind corn, but also to run sawmills and stuff like that. So the harnessing of energy sources, boosting productivity, and at the same time the widespread introduction of three-field crop rotation, so crops being rotated from field to field around a village, three-field system, so that one of the fields is left fallow each year. So that combination leads to significant advance in agricultural productivity. It leads to higher population pressure. People begin to try and bring more marginal land, marshy land or mountainous land under cultivation, pushing the sort of boundaries of cultivation further out. I'm not going to go into the details of any of this, but the Cistercian monasteries are sort of at the forefront of this. They're the sort of pioneers in bringing some of this land under cultivation. Totally connected with this, population increases, people running away from the land into the cities, into the towns. A revival of town life, of urban life. We talked before about the deurbanization that had accompanied the fall of Rome. We now see sort of quickening of urban life, the beginnings of the re-knitting together of mercantile activity, of merchant trade in Western Europe. This is the period as we get into the 1200s when some of the major universities in Western Europe are going to be founded, Paris and so on. So you start to see new centers of academic learning, new centers of cultural development. So this period of the High Middle Ages is really one of economic advance on the basis of the feudal economy, and cultural developments, as you would expect, sort of accompanying that. And now, as we get towards the 1300s, the Little Ice Age, the Black Death, the consequences, increasingly poorer harvest, hunger, brigandage, as I said. So we get into a period of where these more marginal settlements start to really get into difficulties. So you're already in a situation of some tension, and then the impact of the Black Death and the changing climatic conditions coming into that. This has some important effects. The most obvious one is suddenly there's a lot less people around to do the work. I mean, I've just been talking about 40, 50, 60% mortality. I mean, huge mortality, mostly among the lower classes. So suddenly we have a situation where the feudal lords are trying to make people do more work, make sure they can't leave the land, intensify how much unpaid work they have to do on the Lord's land, all of that kind of stuff. And of course, at the same time, the peasants themselves realize we're in a much better bargaining position. There's not so many of us. They need us more. If we organize, if we fight, we may be able to extract some concessions from the feudal elites. So right across Europe, I mean, literally from Poland to Spain, you're going to see in this period, in the period following the Black Death, you're going to see a period of peasant revolts. The left-hand illustration is the Grange Jacquerie in northern France, supposedly led by some guy called Jacques, who of course fictitious character, and you can see in the illustration bloody slaughter of knights, people being thrown into the river and burnt, and all kinds of stuff going on there. This is really right across northern France, and a little bit later in England, the famous peasants' revolt in England, 1381, when basically a big army of peasants marches on London. Unfortunately, they're a little too trusting of the willingness of the king to sort of help them, and as you can see in the picture here, their leader, Wat Tyler, is lured into parley with the king and unceremoniously chopped down. So these are not, and then the revolt is pretty brutally repressed by the English monarchy and the nobility. So the outcome of these revolts is not a given by any means. But the existence of them right across Europe sort of indicates the degree of social crisis that I'm talking about, and the outcomes are really quite different. In France, small peasant farmers actually are able to secure more permanent rights to their land. It's one of the reasons why French agriculture to this day remains very small peasant farm based. On the contrary, in England, there's an accelerating dispossession of small farmers, small peasants who are driven off the land, who are turned into agricultural wage workers, no longer have access to land of their own. We see the establishment of a class of wealthy tenant farmers and the increasing marketization of agriculture in England. In other words, beginning to grow crops, particularly in the area around London, to grow crops for the market. So these class struggles have really different outcomes. They have a different outcome in France and in England, in a certain sense, the relative success of the French peasantry and the relative failure of the equivalent in England paves the way for an acceleration of capitalist development, capitalist agriculture in England. Everywhere across Europe, this is tied to an acceleration of urban life. In particular, in Italy, in northern Italy, and in Flanders, in the region, the Low Countries, Netherlands, modern-day Netherlands, and Belgium, we're going to see sort of increased pace of urban life, mercantile activity. These towns are never really totally under the control of the feudal lords, the nobility, and the barons, and so on. They're always places where people have been able to have exercise a little bit more freedom. And after the Black Death, and in the context of this sort of broader social crisis, we start to see an acceleration urban vitality, of mercantile activity, and so on and so on and so forth. Well, of course, I'm not going to deal with the cultural aspects in any detail, but as you all, I'm sure, aware, this is totally connected to the Renaissance, the great flowering of art and culture, of humanism, of putting human beings at the sort of center of cultural and artistic concern, the relative, I'm careful about sort of relative displacement of the deity from cultural life. I mean, it's still very prominent. A lot of this is art in churches and stuff, but in terms of sort of thinking about social organization, beginnings of a secularization of culture. In the midst of all this, we have the development of printing. So here's the number of manuscripts estimated, obviously, in Europe up to the 15th century, up to the end of the 1400s. So you can see, I made the point about the Dark Ages being really dark. You can see very, very small numbers of books being written. I mean, they're not being printed, they're being hand copied and circulated mostly through monasteries. By the 15th century, we're up to whatever that is, 5 million manuscripts in Europe. And then 1450, we have the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in Germany, and you'll see the number of copies of the books there, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, up into the billions. I mean, massive circulation of literature, that bottom graph, the first chart I showed would probably just about come up to the first blue bar there. So, I mean, this is a gigantic explosion of the circulation of written texts, along with the secularization of these texts, as I've been describing. This now sort of reaches much beyond the monasteries. We have a secular elite, mercantile elite that starts to have its own libraries. People have books in their I mean, merchants have books in their houses. The degree of learning accelerates dramatically. So these are all indications of the breakdown of the feudal economy in Europe. And I want to make a sort of couple of points about that. This is facilitated by I don't know. I wasn't totally sure how to explain this. So I'm just going to say the Swiss cheese nature of feudal society. These are not. It sort of takes a little bit of a leap for us to imagine this, because we're very used to the idea of societies are relatively homogeneous. The same laws applying right across the country, and the same currency, and the same legal system, and the same administrative systems more or less apply anywhere in the country. But of course, in feudal kingdoms, that really was not the case. I've sort of touched on this in the last lecture. These were very heterogeneous social formations. Even the strongest king in feudal society was battling his leading nobles who had their own private armies. There was no state monopoly of violence, etc., etc. The point of that, there was a lot of space, there were a lot of cracks, there were a lot of interstices in feudal society where the direct control of the nobility was weaker. Obviously, this is particularly true in towns, but in other areas as well. And what that meant was that capitalism, that merchant activity, that trade could begin in some parts of countries, not countrywide, not nationwide. Even the idea of a nation is still a little bit of an anomaly in this period. But in particular towns, think Tuscany, think Siena, think Florence, think the clusters of towns towns in central Italy, or think Bruges and the other towns in Flanders, little networked areas of urban centres somewhat out of the control of feudal lords, and they often have to fight to defend their independence, of course, where different forms of economic activity can start to develop over a period of time. And of course, these are both systems of private property. Feudalism and capitalism both depend on private ownership. So it's possible for a feudal noble, for example, to turn some of his land over to capitalist farming, to grow crops for sale on the market rather than for direct consumption. I'm not going to get in this here, but it's what I'm saying here has some very, very important implications for the possibilities of transition from capitalism to other forms of social organization. Because what this means in feudalism is that economic power could develop within the pockets of feudal society before they had to fight for political control, before they had to take form actual modern pro-capitalist nation states. It could take place within the framework of the old feudal societies. In fact, in the first instance, the merchant elites are going to support the kings, the monarchies. They're actually going to help strengthen the monarchies against some of the more unruly nobles. This is kind of often referred to as the formation of the new monarchies or the absolutist states. So if you look at a map of Europe in 1500, you can see these states, these larger states, with starting to form. Spain, the final ejection of the Arabs from Spain, the unification of the Spanish kingdom, France, pretty close to its modern borders, except a little bit in the east. Burgundy still separate state. England, relatively unified state by the 1500s. The monarchies in all of those kingdoms sort of drawing resources from the mercantile elites and beginning to use those resources, for example, to begin to set up permanent standing armies financed by taxes in those countries. Germany, whole different matter. As you can see, Germany remains extremely fragmented politically. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And I just want to draw you. I daren't walk towards the screen. I'm going to put. But look at this. Look at the weight of the scope of the Ottoman Empire in 1500. This area, all of modern Turkey and Greece, right up into the Balkans. The northern Balkans actually starting to move towards Austria. And I talked a little bit about the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the last lecture. Okay. Beginnings of mercantile capitalism in Western Europe. This coincides with significant advances in naval technology. Actually, the importation of techniques, the compass from China, the astrolabe navigational instrument from the Middle East, the lateen sail, the triangular sail at the back of the sailing ships for greater mobility, also from the Middle East, and bringing these technologies and sort of fusing them with the heavy-duty ocean-going, initially North Sea going or coastal fringes of Spain, Iberia, the Atlantic coast, strong, well-constructed ocean-going ships. By about 1500, we get the development out of that of the galleon. capable of carrying heavy cannon, heavy artillery. At this time, artillery guns are still really much too heavy to be easily used in land battles. They're very, very difficult to move around, but of course easy to move around on by ship. So you get the development of naval technology that's both transportation, travel, and trade, and military technology, sophisticated military technology. By far the most sort of potent naval weapons system in the world at the time, and of course being sort of driven by this revival of mercantile activity I've been talking about. This begins in Western Europe. Genoa and Venice in northern Italy, trade routes that connected over land, sea routes through the Black Sea, sea routes to the Eastern Mediterranean, and then land routes into the old Silk Road. But remember what we just saw about the domination of the Eastern Mediterranean by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans take their cut of all trade through their territory. It starts to significantly increase the cost of importation through the Eastern Mediterranean. So there's a significant economic impetus towards trying to find new trade routes, particularly new trade routes to India and Southeast Asia, India in particular, which of course had been well known right back to Roman times. I've touched on that before, but now we're going to start to see, particularly initially from Portugal, beginning in the late 1400s, the beginnings of Portuguese exploration, as they see it, discovery, as they see it, down the west coast of Africa. By the end of the 1480s, Diaz finally gets around the southern tip, the Cape of Good Hope, turns back pretty quickly, but demonstrates that there is a southern tip to the African continent. You can get around it, and then a couple of years later, a decade or so later, Vasco da Gama sails right around the southern tip of Africa, up the Swahili coast, across the Indian Ocean to Calicut on the western coast of India. So Portuguese now are beginning to open up the possibilities of direct maritime trade from Western Europe into the Indian Ocean. Initially, they're really sort of breaking into existing regional networks of trade by Arab merchants, by Indians, by Chinese, and the Europeans sort of moving into that trade and using their superior naval technology, their superior weapons technology, to establish military predominance, and obviously with that taking over the trade. And of course, a lot of that is going to begin to be shipped back through Portugal into the markets of Western Europe, cutting out the middlemen, particularly cutting out the Ottoman Empire. So you start to get the integration of Europe directly into these trade networks of the Indian Ocean. I don't know how well you can see this; it's not particularly clear, but anyway, by 1550. These are all Portuguese outposts, trading outposts. So you can see on the west coast of Africa, on the Swahili coast of Africa, right across several places on the coast of India, including Goa, which remains a Portuguese colony until the 1960s, I'm going to say, maybe 50s, into Malacca, into Malaysia, into modern-day Indonesia, and then eventually into the South China Sea, to Japan, to China, and at the same time, although it's basically by accident, the discovery by the Portuguese of the great bulge of South America, and the Portuguese colonization of northeastern bulge of South America. It's the reason, of course, Brazil remains Portuguese speaking. So really, we're talking about just less than a century, the Portuguese expanding this really the first great trading empire. This is not a territorial empire. This is not colonizing huge chunks of territory. It's an empire of trading outposts. Well, of course, even more dramatic is going to be the Spanish contribution to this, beginning in 1492, the same year that they finally complete finally drive the last of the Arab settlements out of the Spanish peninsula. They expel most of the Jews as well. It's a pretty brutal, as they describe it, the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain. And right on the back of that, of course, we're going to get the Spanish state sponsoring Columbus to find a route to China that can beat the Portuguese. A quicker route to China, by sailing westward across the Atlantic. Nobody, by the way, thought the world was flat. Nobody thought that they were just going to drop. They understood the world was round since at least Ptolemy in antiquity. The big debate is how big, how round, how far is it? And Columbus's great contribution to navigation was completely screwing it up. He underestimates the circumference of the world by about a third, and on that basis, of course, convinces the Spanish that it's going to be really, really quick to get to China by sailing west. And what he runs into is the American continent, which he for a long time continued to believe he was arriving at islands that were somewhere close to the kingdom of the great Khan, to China. What he does find, of course, once they get over the disappointment of it not being China, is they do find tremendous resources of gold and of silver. And what's unleashed over the next 100 years or so is an intense and brutal series of conquests that establish Spanish power in the Americas. The wonderful mural by Diego Rivera that captures some of this. Tremendous, particularly in the Caribbean, tremendous brutality accompanying this. 1519, Hernan Cortez and a small army overthrow the Aztec Empire. I described a little bit about the structure of the Aztec Empire previously. Basically a city-state with a lot of subject peoples, and the Spanish very cleverly form alliances with the oppressed subjects of the Aztecs and use them to help leverage these tiny European armies overthrowing the Inca Empire. By the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro overthrows the Inca Empire. He again is fortress, tiny army, 50, 60 men and a couple of cannons. He has the good fortune to arrive as there's a sort of tremendous factional struggle in the between the Inca elites is raging, and to sort of insert himself and his military force into that. So two really remarkable military conquests: the overthrow of the Aztec Empire, the overthrow of the Inca, all of course sustained and backed up by a gigantic wave of disease, the introduction of smallpox, that's going to take, at least in some of the native populations, up to 90% mortality. So I mean, devastating disease, and on the basis of that, the establishment over the next sort of 100 years or so of a huge Spanish empire centered in Central America, but reaching north into the modern day United States, and south down the Andes, the old Inca Empire, and along the Atlantic coast of South America. This empire is fundamentally structured to extract silver and to ship it back to Spain. Later there will be some agricultural settlement, Spanish agricultural settlement, but this is a different pattern of settlement that we're going to see in the North American colonies. There's not a lot of Spanish farmers. There's basically Spanish elites, warriors settling in the Americas, and being organized by the Spanish state into essentially facilitating the export of silver. So by the first couple of decades of the 1500s, as we get into the reign of Charles V of Spain, we're talking about American silver accounting for something like 20% of the Spanish annual state budget. So you can imagine the enormous additional capacity that the Spanish state is going to get by this sort of essentially exogenous and unanticipated injection of enormous quantities of silver. It basically allows the Spanish state to become the premier power of Europe for the next best part of the next 100 years. They form a marriage alliance between the Spanish and the Austrian Habsburgs, which brings under their control not only the Iberian Peninsula itself, and of course the American colonies, but also most of Italy, Austria, the central Germany, big chunk of the south eastern corner of modern-day France, and the Low Countries, and the modern-day Netherlands and Belgium. So all under Spanish rule, powerful professional army, all funded essentially from the proceeds of Spanish colonial settlement in the Americas. Okay, before I look at a couple of other things, I just really briefly want to just say something about China. It's kind of an interesting contrast. I talked about the fall of the Yuan dynasty, the beginnings of the Ming dynasty, and by 1400s we're sort of at the height of Ming power, and the Ming are keen to spread diplomatic influence throughout the Indian Ocean, and they sponsored the voyages of this guy, Admiral Zheng He, who has a gigantic fleet of warships. I mean, far bigger than the contemporary European ships. And you can see he makes 4 voyages altogether. The map is a composite of their track, but includes this is essentially a sort of diplomatic and military This is like sailing a modern American aircraft carrier into somebody's port. It makes a powerful statement of Chinese power, and you can see right up into the Persian Gulf, into the Red Sea, down the east coast of Africa, throughout Indonesia, Malaya, and so on. So big Chinese presence. This is not discovery. Chinese merchants are already trading in these regions, but it is showing the power of the and interest of the Chinese state in developing that. Ironically, pretty much as soon as he gets home after the final voyage in 1433, the Ming government demobilizes the fleet. The ships are all I guess the modern equivalent would be mothballed. They're basically left to rot, and the Ming dynasty very demonstratively sort of turns inward from these efforts at sort of external diplomacy and power projection. It remains a big debate why that was the case. It's, in my opinion, connected to the traditional Confucian attitude towards merchants. Merchants are regarded as a necessary evil. They're always problematic because if merchants start to do well and accumulate individual fortunes, they can tend to start to challenge the government. So the Chinese dynasties had traditionally not wanted to have the development of private mercantile activity. The ideal in Chinese society, Ming Dynasty Chinese society, was public service. In fact, the children of successful merchants often go on to sit the civil service exam and to become administrators, to become state civil servants. That's the sort of height of accomplishment. So it's a very sort of different view, and it's connected to this withdrawal of Chinese power from the Indian Ocean. I'm not going to say any more about this here, but there's obviously an interesting thought experiment. This is 1433. It's only 70 years or so before the Portuguese arrive in the Indian Ocean. Those times are totally arbitrary to a certain extent. It would be kind of an interesting development had the Portuguese arrived in an Indian Ocean still dominated by the Chinese. Anyway, that doesn't happen, so there's no point getting too deeply into it. But it's, these things that all, with hindsight, all seem very cut and dried, are a lot more contingent than they often seem. Okay, so moving on. Portuguese develop trading relations on the coast of Africa. This is the Congo Kingdom, not exactly the modern Republic of Congo, as you can see, but overlapping into a good chunk of northern Angola. The king of the Congo converts to Christianity to form a diplomatic alliance with the Portuguese, and they begin to develop a trading outpost here and in other points on the west coast of Africa. And pretty quickly, the main trade, the main export from Africa is going to be slaves. The Portuguese, of course, are able to trade manufactured goods, and they are purchasing slaves. And most of the slaves, it's essentially pretty lethal for Europeans to go into the interior of Africa. They have no protection from yellow fever and malaria and the other prevalent diseases. So not only here, but throughout the Atlantic slave trade, most of the slaves are going to be who are sold to European slave traders are actually going to be captured by African princes from the coastal kingdoms who are sort of raiding into the interior and stashing slaves in fact what they describe as factories like this one on the coast, basically huge slave compounds on their coast, and the European slave traders are going to come and purchase them there. By the early 1500s, the Portuguese on the little island of Sao Tome, just off the, in the Bight of Benin, off the west coast of Africa, make the, I don't know, fortuitous or deeply unfortuitous discovery that they can grow sugar cane with slave labor. Sugar cane demanding a high degree of labor-intensive cultivation. So they begin to develop this on the African coast, and very rapidly thereafter they begin to export this to the Caribbean, to Brazil, modern-day Brazil, and to the other colonies of the Americas. And what begins, of course, is the Atlantic slave trade. So we're going to see somewhere around 12 million slaves. I mean, the numbers are just stunning. 12 million slaves captured in Africa, 12.5 million slaves. About 10 million of them are actually going to make it across the Atlantic. The others are going to die in transit. The picture I showed at the start, the opening picture, was a Turner painting from the 1840s of slaves being thrown over the side of a slave ship as a storm, threatened by a storm. So brutal conditions. The diagram on the bottom right there is a slave ship, the Brook, and you can see slaves just stacked on several levels. I mean, barely room to turn over, chained for most of the voyage, and sold to the sugar plantations. A little bit later, we're going to see the development of tobacco, indigo, rice in the British colonies in North America. What this sets in motion, sometimes referred to as the Atlantic economy, is really the economic dynamo of the beginnings of modern Europe. The triangular trade, in reality it's much more polygonal than it is triangular, but I'm just going to describe the sort of basic structure of it. The export of manufactured goods from England in particular to West Africa, where they're going to be traded for slaves, the middle passage, the shipment of slaves to the Americas, and then the export from the Americas, Caribbean and the Americas, of sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, and of course later we're going to see the development of cotton, slave-based cotton production in the southern United States. This is fantastically profitable. It's the real sort of driving profit center of the economy between sort of 1600 and the middle of the 1700s. It's never a huge proportion of gross domestic product, but it's the sort of profitability and the surplus generating capacity of this trade that's going to create enormous fortunes for the merchants engaged in it. And next week I will talk a little bit about one of the main things that fortune is going to be used for, how that profit is going to be used, which of course will be by the late 1700s will be to invest in industrial industry and in industrial production, and is going to fund the sort of initial takeoff of the Industrial Revolution in England, which really does, in a financial sense, rest on the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, before we get to next week, there's one other big issue I want to cover quickly tonight. While all this is going on, 1500s onwards, one of the other great consequences of this social and economic transformation that's sort of accelerating in Europe is going to unfold. And it's deeply interwoven with the rise of capitalism. And I'm talking, of course, about the Protestant Reformation. How it's interwoven with capitalism, I'm not going to get too deeply into tonight, although we may want to talk about, for a long time historians sort of theorized quite sort of crudely that this was the Protestant work ethic, that Protestant just worked harder in some fashion. But I don't think anyone would necessarily subscribe to that view today. But there's undoubtedly some relationship between the rise of Protestantism and the rise of capitalism in Europe. An intertwined process of these two social and economic and religious/political developments, how those things interrelate. And of course, none of this was really Luther's goal. Luther sets out to fairly modest reform of what he viewed as the worst. Luther's a Catholic priest. What he views as the worst excesses of Catholicism, the sale of papal indulgences, basically a get straight to heaven card, and correcting the corruption of the clergy, relatively modest, but not the first. If you look back through medieval Europe, there'd been a whole series of Reformation-type movements that had set out to try and reform the Catholic Church at many other points during medieval Europe, and they'd all remained sort of relatively isolated movements. And now suddenly we have this Reformation that breaks much beyond those limited boundaries. I talked earlier about the idea of religion both being a sort of bottom-up expression of rebellion and a top-down sort of expression of social control. And you really see both aspects here. One of the first things that happens is that Protestantism inspires a gigantic revolt by the German peasants in the southern part of Germany, the so-called peasant war, where peasants take this all very, very, very seriously. This is a religion that validates the individual, your direct relationship with God. You don't need the mediation of a priest. You don't need all. You worship in your own language. You're not in Latin. You can actually understand what it's about. You're encouraged to read. All of these things have a sort of liberating sort of aspect in a certain sense. And this gigantic peasant rebellion against the continuing aspects of feudal domination of Germany. Anyway, all that's absolutely crushed with the loss of thousands and thousands of peasants are slaughtered in the course of that. So that sort of bottom-up thing doesn't last very long. What it's succeeded by is basically individual princes. Remember how fragmented Germany looked? A lot of the local princes, particularly in the northern part of Germany, are going to adopt Protestantism essentially as a political lever to justify their political separation from the control of the Catholic Holy Roman Empire. And so the biggest expression of that, of course, is going to be the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. And the consequence of that war is that Germany remains deeply divided, politically fragmented, separated along religious lines right through until the 1860s. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there's two, and this is the final thing I want to look at today, two really, really important aspects of this process that I want to highlight in two very, very important countries. The first is to talk about the revolt of the Dutch Republic, or what becomes the Dutch Republic, against the Spanish rule. You'll remember when I showed that map of the Charles V's empire, the Low Countries are part of are under Habsburg, Spanish Habsburg rule, and the people of the Low Countries, well, I'm sort of saying Dutch, but they're proto-Dutch, I guess, adopt Calvinism, adopt the Calvinist brand of Christianity, of Protestantism, and it infuses their revolt, their political and military revolt against Spanish domination. This is sometimes referred to as the 80 Years' War. The revolt begins with really a massive popular rebellion, a great outburst of iconoclasm. In other words, they're smashing Catholic churches, they're pulling down statues and stuff like that, and thoroughly annoying the Spanish, who send a gigantic army to try and crush them. And the war goes on for the next 80 years. As you can see from the map, they're only about half successful. The southern part of the Low Countries, modern day Belgium, actually remains under Spanish control, but the northern part, modern day Holland, give or take, does become an independent state as the United Provinces. So a new nation state emerges through this revolt against Spanish rule, Calvinist in religion, mercantile in outlook. This is a really sort of bourgeois type. This is led by merchant elites, and established in what I'm going to argue can be regarded as the first real modern nation state. In other words, the state that's going to use its state power and to actively promote the extension of capitalism and mercantile trade. This is an amazing thing. In the course of the war, map's not so clear, but you kind of get the idea. The red dots all over the world is the Dutch Empire, trading empire that's established during the course of the... So while they're fighting Spain, at the same time as they're fighting Spain, they are building a naval capacity through the semi-state organization, the Dutch East India Company, and a lot of these places, as you can see, they're picking up what had been Portuguese trading bases, trading outposts, picking up the colonies in the southern tip of Africa. The reason, of course, that the Dutch-speaking Boer people get established in southern Africa, the coast of Brazil for a while, and colonies in the Caribbean, and as you'll see right up there in the north, the colony of the New Netherlands in modern day New York, from New Amsterdam, New York City, up the Hudson River to Albany, Fort Orange, and the fur trading network northwards from that. So this is all put together during that 80-year revolt against the Spanish rule. A new form of state. I wouldn't say democratic as you might think it, but one in which there's broadly equal citizenship. The aristocracy is very uninfluential. This is a capitalist state led by the merchant elite. Okay, the second place, fairly obviously, I'm going to talk about is Britain, is England specifically, and Henry VIII. Of course, in the 1530s, has his own troubles with Rome, and just as the German princes had done, the North German princes had done, he adopts Protestantism to get some leverage over Rome to nullify his marriage and legitimize his line of succession. So from then on, England is nominally a Protestant Protestant state. But it's still a monarchy, and the monarchy in the early 1600s, the monarchy tries to, under Charles I, tries to become more like the French state, the powerful, very powerful centralized monarchy in France. And in doing so provokes a popular rebellion in Britain, in England, led by the merchant sections of the merchant elite, and supported by a broad sort of plebeian revolt. And Charles is overthrown. He's executed. England becomes a republic. Sadly, doesn't stay that way, as you all know. But by the time the monarchy is restored, well, it's a long story, which I'm not. This monarchy is restored in 1660. They try again to become an absolute. They have another binge of trying to become an absolutist state, and they get overthrown again in 1688. And this time, the British establish a constitutional monarchy. So in other words, the monarch is going to be essentially under the control, pretty much, of a parliament that is essentially representing the mercantile and business elites in England. Somewhat like the development that had just happened in the Dutch Republic. This is sometimes referred to, this is the final thing I'm going to say, sometimes referred to as a fiscal military state. So this is a relatively kind of light state. It's not doing a lot of, it has no welfare provisions or education or anything of that character, but it's a professional state. It's run by professional civil servants and administrators. Its job is to tax people. The primary form of taxation is import duties on goods coming into Britain. Does it very efficiently, and to spend that money on the Navy. The British Royal Navy is going to become the predominant navy in the world. In the late 1600s, they're going to fight 3 wars with the Dutch. New Amsterdam becomes New York, the New Netherlands becomes a British colony, and the British are going to begin to emerge by the early 1700s as the next world dominant imperial empire, trading initially very much like the Dutch, initially not big territorial conquest, but trading empire, backed by this modern nation state, capitalist nation state, with its constitutional monarchy, its parliamentary democracy, etc., etc., etc. So you start to see by the end of this period, and in connection with what's going on at the same time as I've described it, the slave trade, the profits generated by that, the beginnings of British overseas colonization, the beginnings of the British overseas empire, the resources that are going to, by the end of the 1700s, begin to lead to the industrialization of Britain and the first industrial power in the world. But we'll talk about that next week. So, thank you very much.